Welcome to The Thread. This is the place for fresh perspectives on Christian leadership, global culture, and evangelism in our fast-changing world. Hosted by me, Stephen Foster, and brought to you by Alpha. And I'm really excited that our guest today is Steve Chao. Steve is a broadcaster, a journalist, and film director, and I'm really excited about what he is going to share with us today. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
It's great to have you with us. And just say a little bit, Steve, so you the director of the Chinese Alpha film series, also the director of the youth series, which just was released this year. And you're also working as the director for the next Alpha film series, which is beginning filming this autumn. And before that, you worked as a journalist and broadcaster with Al Jazeera and other organizations.
Yes, it's been quite an exciting sort of career, and especially the last several years working on these Alpha films. Quite different from the kind of storytelling that I was used to for most of my career, but it's been exhilarating.
And just say a little bit, because you've done some amazing roles, Steve, and you were often embedded in war zones with Al Jazeera. Say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I spent about probably 20 years going in and out of Afghanistan. I was there for the fall of the Taliban in 2001, and then their rise, a few years ago. Been covering wars and conflicts world over, whether that's Myanmar or Syria. I always felt that God was calling me into these places to really shine a light, sort of in areas where, it was underreported. And the whole hope, I think, was that people would understand more about what's happening in the world and maybe care a little bit more.
Well, we're going to hear some more about that. But tell us, Steve, first your own story of faith, because you grew up in Toronto, and I don't think your parents had Christian faith, and you didn't grow up as a Christian. So say a little bit about your upbringing and how you kind of came to faith.
Yeah, well, I love controversy. I love conflict. So maybe I just start with a little bit of controversial. I came to faith when I decided pretty much not to hurt or kill somebody.
Wow.
Yeah, so basically, this was high school. I was 16 years old, had grown up in a pretty sort of rough family, and I had gravitated towards, Asian gangs that were operating quite a bit in Toronto at the time. And in high school, my older sister, by a little bit, ended up running away from home with her English teacher. He was also my English teacher, and he was 50 plus years old. And my Dai Lo at the time, which means big brother in Cantonese, which also means, my big boss in the gangs, came up to me and said, "This teacher has disrespected your family, has disrespected you, and this is just wrong. Say yes, and I'll take care of it." What was happening around that time was that, there were a number of Christians in my high school, and they had started sort of sharing Jesus with me. And I was very, very, very argumentative, perhaps like Nicky Gumbel when he was young too. And I took them on, but they spent 6 months just sharing and sharing. And when this happened, I was almost at a point of, okay, this Jesus guy was quite amazing. His story of grace was quite amazing. And I remember spending a night on a hill considering what my Dai Lo offered. And then the next morning I said, I can't do it. And normally in the past me would have said, yes, let's do it. This is the right thing. And then a week later, my sister came back to visit my mom at our small business. And my mom locked the door. And she said, "You are too young to be going off with an English teacher that's 50 years old. You're only 17, you're too young." And my sister screamed. And the teacher, who's like a big Chuck Norris farm type guy, he ended up smashing through the glass door. I was working in the warehouse in the back, and when I saw my stepdad, a little tiny Asian guy, squaring off against this big guy, in my head I was like, I was so wrong. Why was I so weak in that moment? I remember picking up a 2x4 filled with anger and started running to the front office. But as I did, I heard this voice. And this voice was like, "Hey, hold on. Hold on, hold on." And I remember still running. And then eventually I stopped. And that voice said, "If you really believe in me, let go and let me." And I still remember this to this day. And I remember resisting and then saying, okay. And I remember the anger in me just left my body. This peace just washed from head to toe. And I know that now is the Holy Spirit, Jesus working.
Wow.
But it was incredible. And I remember then going into the side office, calling the cops. Cops came. My parents decided not to press any charges. And it did take like 10 years for my sister to leave this teacher. But that really began my journey in following God. And I left the Asian gangs, and it's been different ever since.
Wow, so it's kind of a pivotal moment. You're being, on the one hand, being drawn deeper and deeper into kind of the gangs in Toronto. And then at the same time, these friends are sharing about Jesus with you. And that's kind of the key moment in where your faith began, really.
Yeah, it was really the pivotal moment. And I think from that moment on, I said, God, Jesus, you're my Dailo. Whatever you ask me to do, I will do. And that sort of is what led me into journalism.
Wow. Say a bit about that. So you're in Toronto, you're beginning your faith journey, and then you start exploring journalism. And say a bit about what drove you into that career.
Yeah, I think I always craved justice deep down, even though I was doing a lot of messy, bad things as a youth, perhaps not, justice things. Yeah. But I think I always craved justice. And I remember when I was 19, first year university, I was asking God again, okay, God, what do you want me to do? And I ended up on a missions trip in Guatemala. We were in the highlands of Guatemala on the border with Mexico. And we were doing health surveys for a small NGO. And there was a coup. And during this coup, the villagers hid us in the mountains. The airport in Guatemala City was shut down. And in the midst of that, a lot of violence. And villagers, the most innocent, as always, were being killed by both sides. And when the airport finally opened and we flew out, I remember grabbing an old Time magazine from a week earlier, and it has that section that says, This Week in News.
Yeah.
And in Guatemala, it said, a bloodless coup.
Really?
And, being in the hills, no one was reporting on what was going on in the rural areas. And at that moment, I was like, okay, God, maybe this is your message to me. Get out there in the least reported areas and let the world know what's going on. And I remember getting back to Toronto, giving a journalism school a phone call and saying, I know we're a month away from the start of schools. I'd like to change degrees. Will you let me in? And I prayed about it. And amazingly, they don't usually do this. They said, okay, change your university, come over and start. And then I started into journalism, 2 years into studying. I got my first job as a local reporter in a local station.
And you spent, as you said, almost 20 years in Afghanistan, on and off reporting, and right in the midst of a very dangerous war zone. I remember we were doing some work together once, and you were telling me that to this day, your sleep is affected because you had to be ready to dive under your bed at any moment because of the sound, the particular sound that a ballistic missile makes.
Yeah, I used to sleep so well, but then after Afghanistan, like oftentimes we'd be embedded with NATO troops, US, Canadian, and we got so used to hearing these rockets that the Taliban would fire. They basically would put them on timers. Yeah. And so we'd be sleeping on cots and, in a desert somewhere. And if you heard a little poof, that sort of, you had to be always on the guard for that, because then you knew that there was a missile being sent in. And then if you couldn't hear the whistle, you knew it was coming right down on you. And so we often had 5 seconds to roll off that cot and get low and just wait to see where that missile would hit.
Goodness me. And sometimes people say your passion is what you're prepared to suffer for. So the word passion means pasche, the Greek, it means to suffer. And so it feels like your passion to share what's really going on in these places of conflict has driven you to suffer a little bit and to put yourself in very challenging spaces. Say a bit about that.
That's a beautiful way to describe passion. I think that's definitely true with me. I always tell people that I felt, because I had this deep yearning for justice, a deep yearning to sort of speak truth to power, that then I just naturally gravitated towards these hard places. And then I was born to suffer. And I've often told people I felt I was born to suffer.
Really?
Yeah, and so it naturally I could have chosen sports journalism, and chased Tottenham, or
Tottenham has suffering as well.
Suffering as well, right? Yeah,
kind
definitely, a different kind of suffering, not winning perhaps as often as their fans would like.
Yeah.
I gravitated towards the hard. I did a lot of investigative journalism.
Yes.
Where you were often like posing as somebody else. And you're exposing gangs or
undercover journalism.
Undercover journalism, where we put on like
you disguises. Do like child trafficking. You've done some work in
child trafficking, wildlife trafficking, drug trafficking. We chased the world's biggest drug lord for a long time, and that comes at a huge cost.
Yeah,
I've had a lot of people I've worked with killed. Okay. A young producer in Afghanistan, murdered. His murder has never been properly investigated. But and then there's been times where I've been blown up by suicide bombers in Afghanistan in a convoy, and seen friends of mine die, or suffered some shrapnel wounds. But I think that because of that passion, that real desire for justice, it just kept you going. But it does come at a cost.
And just say, Steve, what difference has your faith made when you've been in these highly charged moments? I mean, often it's drug lords who are chasing other people, but you were chasing drug lords down as an investigative journalist. It's very brave, and kind of being willing to make enemies. And what difference has your faith made as you've been in those contexts?
I would say it's made all the difference. I have lots of friends who are fellow journalists that have been in some of the hardest places, and it gets you really depressed. Because you look at the world and you see the darkest side of the world, and you realize in many ways that civility is only just surface in this world.
Yeah.
And you just have it doesn't take much to scratch the surface. And we humans are naturally selfish, driven by greed, pride, ego. And then you realize that we don't have the solutions for the world. So, seeing the death and destruction and the injustice. I've had lots of friends end up, alcoholics, drug addicts, because of seeing that pain. And for myself, I've had massive post-traumatic stress, PTSD. And there's been moments where I'm like, mostly, why doesn't the world care more?
Yeah.
And why doesn't the world care more?
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for Jesus, if it wasn't for that hope and that understanding that he loves us through all of the weaknesses of us as humans, I don't think I could continue.
Yeah.
I've been in so many, like my Bible study here, oftentimes I'd come back from the war zone after 6 weeks just disheveled and beat down, and I'd be like, down in the dumps. And then, one of my Bible study leaders or one of the men, I'd just like share this with them. Yeah. And just spending time in the Word, praying together. Talk about incredible healing.
Really? Yes.
Yeah. God hears. There's been times in Afghanistan, one time when I lost a really good friend of mine, a soldier. He was like the all-American, good-looking boy, football, kind of quarterback. And he was blown up, and he died. And I remember having to call his wife and talk it over. And then the next week, I was sent back into Afghanistan. And I remember sitting at a base going, Lord, I really need you. I really need you today, because I don't see you here. And I know exactly where Afghanistan's going, and there's going to be kids killed. There's going to be mothers killed. There's just so much injustice. And then at that moment, I saw this dude walking down the street at the forward operating base where we were at. And he had a little boy in tow. And normally that's a sign, maybe suicide bomber, we don't know. So we went behind the barriers, what they call the HESCOs, these sand walls. And then the Canadian soldiers trained their guns on him. The interpreter yelled, "What do you want?" And he said, "You guys are infidels. And if I could, I would kill you all. But my 6-year-old grandson has cancer. And I have nowhere else to turn to." And that morning, what I didn't know at the forward operating base was there was an armored ambulance that had arrived, and there was so there was medical help. They brought the little boy in, and the doctor was feeling around, and sure enough, he had cancer. The ambulance driver was a young Christian.
Wow.
And he swore a mile a minute, he had the foulest mouth possible, I think. And he was like bleeping, Chow, this, hey, come here. I'm like, what's going on, Brian? He's like, hey, if you can get this on the evening news tonight about what's happening with this boy, my bleeping church back in Canada can bleep and help, I think.
Really?
Yes. And then sure enough, we put the story out about this young boy. And then after that first week, they raised $20,000. It went up to $80,000 the next week. And they got him to India for medical help.
Wow.
The boy unfortunately passed, but the money left over helped pay for part of a children's ward in Kandahar.
Really?
And this came from out of that morning crying to God saying, please show up. I need you. And it's happened again and again and again. And I think that the lesson I've seen, is that, he doesn't always speak.
Yeah.
We know that.
Yeah.
Oftentimes he's quiet, and there's a reason for it, and you have to trust in it. So there's a lot of faith building through that. But when he does, it's powerful. And what I've learned is that we as people need to push ourselves out of our comfort zone.
Yeah.
To allow God to work, and I just I've been fortunate enough to be in these places where there isn't much comfort. So, I've had God speak so loudly sometimes, and I'm quite stubborn too. So God probably has to speak loudly so I can hear. But yeah, I think, seeing God work like that.
Yeah.
And I can give you so many examples of that.
Yeah.
When we cry out to God in a place outside our comfort, he shows up.
It's so powerful, Steve. One of the things I really admire about you is you're drawn to stories, and you're particularly drawn to the redemptive arc in stories. And it feels to me that's connected to kind of your love for Jesus and the difference Jesus has made in your own life. And then you love communicating stories about people. Say a bit about the power of story and where that's come from in your life and why you think it's so significant for us.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording about how powerful redemption is. And I think, growing up as I did, I think that yearning for things to be made right, that justice, and that second chance for people. I've made so many mistakes in my life, again and again, even after getting to know Jesus.
Yeah.
Just so many mistakes. And, knowing that God and Jesus says, okay, if you recognize that, just, you're still loved even through it, but you recognize it and I will redeem it. I think that's the most powerful thing, in this world today. And I think that's what draws me to redemption. The fact that we all get a chance at being redeemed because Jesus loves us. And so, before we started recording, I was saying, this is why I love programs like The Voice, right?
Yeah.
You've got this journey of all these people who've gone through whatever they have. They've been trying to make it, perhaps got so many turndowns.
Yeah.
And here's their opportunity to perform well and have a chair turned and have their lives turned around.
Yes.
And that's redemption.
Yeah.
Getting a chance to have our lives that may have gone off the track, brought back.
And just say a bit about the story in particular. So I know that you're fascinated by the impact that stories have on our minds and the kind of compelling power of stories in people's lives.
Yeah. So journalism, I see it as twofold.
Yeah.
Journalism is about truth, speaking truth to power, bringing information that, helps the public, people make informed decisions.
Yeah.
But you can have all the truth, all the information in the world, but if it doesn't move people to act, it does nothing.
Yeah.
And that's where story comes in.
Yes.
What I've learned over all these 30 years of storytelling is that we as humans are wired to learn through story. You see it in the Bible. one of the greatest books that tells the story of God loving us. And then science backs that up. You know, what the latest science research shows is that when you give information through story, our prefrontal cortex lights up. Other things happen in the brain that help us learn and absorb the information. You know, it does a lot of things, like when you tell facts through people's lives, when people tell their story of what's going on, whether it be like a young villager who's lost their village to a big developer, you know, out of corruption. When you hear their story, we connect. You know, and then the science behind that supports it. And I think that's where story is so important. Jesus got that. He was always telling stories. He knew how we as humans were wired because God made us. And so I think that's the power of story. You know, I think that's the way, you know, we reach people and we move hearts and we can change society for the better.
That's really fascinating, Stephen. And how have you learned to tell stories through film? Because you've made this transition from being, you know, broadcaster, journalist, and then film director. And I think you've always been involved behind the scenes, because when you're out in somewhere like Afghanistan, you're doing a lot of it yourself. But to make that step up into overseeing whole film projects, and part of that is trying to communicate these stories visually. And what have you learned about how to do that?
Perhaps the biggest thing is you always need creativity. Is all about being creative, of course. But it's about how do you tell the story in a new, fresh way. One of my, you know, Discovery executive producers always says, how do you be zeitgeist? You know, and that's like the brothers of Issachar, right? Like, you know, like the
know the times.
Know the times, right? And I think that's key. So I think, you know, you have to know the times and then figure out what are fresh ways to tell story. And I think that's how I always approach a new project. How do we tell this differently? What's the unexpected? What are the surprises? You know, we as humans need to have our curiosity piqued. You're only going to pique curiosity if you surprise and you tell it in a fresh, different way and in the language of the generation of today.
And it's interesting talking about language, because one of the things you've done through the Alpha Youth series is to communicate in the language of the rising generation. So there were you and Dan Blythe, amazing project of putting together emerging, you know, kind of Gen Z and generations, younger generations, at every stage of that project to make sure that it communicates in the heart language of the rising generation. And then, but then also with the Chinese Alpha film series, that was an extraordinary project and filmed entirely in China and with Chinese hosts. And say a little bit about, because that was an extraordinary project that you brought together through the pandemic and managed somehow to create in the midst of all the constraints and challenges of that time.
Yeah, you're right. It was in the middle of the pandemic. You know, we when I had said yes to Vinny, who, you know, who's the main vision behind the Chinese version of the Alpha series, you know, COVID hadn't started, and then we began, and it was COVID. So trying to get teams to work, you know, and to be able to film during that time was a challenge by itself. But I think, you know, the amazing thing again is going back to, you know, what is it that makes something creative and interesting. And, you know, people like Dan Blythe, Vinny, they all lived and breathed the culture. Dan Blythe knows youth, you know, and he spent so much time, you know, whether through Barna studies or spending time with the youth themselves. We brought in youth to sort of input constantly into it, so it was their product. It was the same with the Chinese Alpha film series. We talked to so many people. Vinny knew so many people, and we heard about, you know, what really strikes at the heart of the Chinese people. And so I believe that as, you know, getting that and understanding that, we were able then to shape the Alpha program in a way that spoke in their language, what Vinny often calls the heart language.
When I first saw the Chinese Alpha film series, I felt it actually moved me to tears, because it's just so impactful on screen. And it felt with that and the youth that you've managed to it's the wrong way of saying it, but almost like capture the work of the Holy Spirit through film. So it feels like you're communicating not just a story about people, but a story about how the Holy Spirit is working through people's lives. And is that something you've consciously tried to do, or is that something? How has that happened?
That's a good question. I think that only comes through laying it down before God. And I know that sometimes sounds like so easy, so trite, but really through prayer. And I have a specific example on this. About a few months into producing the Chinese Alpha film series, Vinny calls and says, I just had this dream. I dreamed that I was baking or making beautiful buns. And they looked beautiful. The filling was perfect. The outside skin was perfect. I had sort of kneaded it properly. When I pulled it out of the oven, though, and I tasted it, it was flavorless. And I think she felt that was God giving a message that, we need to pray over the Chinese Alpha film series even more than we were. And so then we made a very concerted effort to do that. And I think that you could sense then that, God was really moving through the film series. So I think it always really starts with prayer, and that's what we do with our team. We pray every week, and we pray constantly, and then, we have teams praying from all over the world, even for the Alpha series right now, because we know when you're doing something big for the kingdom, there will be a lot of opposition. And I'll bring it back even 20 years before we did the Chinese Alpha film series, and I'll bring it back to prayer. 20 years before, I was in Sichuan province in China, covering one of the world's biggest earthquakes in a small town where 90% of the buildings had toppled.
Wow.
And it was devastating. We were covering examples of people that had been crushed in the rubble, entire schools covered with rubble, children inside the classrooms. And I remember bumping into a friend of mine who was a Christian there, and he was part of the rescue efforts. And he and I just broke down. And I remember praying with him, and we said, Lord, there is nothing good here. So much pain and misery. But you are a God of goodness. Can you just please birth something good and beautiful out of this? And what I didn't know was, at the time, buried several stories below, was this young lady who was an up-and-coming dancer. And she had had her legs crushed. Her entire apartment building collapsed. Her daughter had died beside her. Her mother-in-law was dead beside her. And she was in this rubble, buried, saying, I have no reason to live, but for some reason I want to hear my father, who I love, one more time. And then she said, if there's a God out there, let it happen. And at that moment, her father, who was searching for her, yelled down, and she heard his voice. And there began her journey of faith. She never had heard about Jesus or God before. But when 24 hours later, the rescue workers could get to her and got her out, some Christians in the community shared God with her, and she came to faith. Fast forward 20 years later, past that prayer my friend and I had, past her being rescued, she was one of the candidates to be host for the Chinese Alpha film series. And her journey was so incredible that we said, yes, she's a double amputee. That doesn't matter. She's, number one, the best host because she's so emotive. And then in episode 5, she told her story. We kept it secret about her experience until episode 5.
Wow.
And then she shared the story of what happened and her own personal journey of coming to faith.
Yes.
And this was God planned. So, again, first prayer, and then trusting that God will work somewhere, maybe 20 years later, whenever.
That's amazing.
And bring goodness.
Wow, Steve, that's an amazing story. I'm stunned. I'm stunned hearing that. Say, Steve, a bit about you, because you've led so many film projects in secular context, so to speak, but also in faith context. And just say about what are the unique kind of challenges and joys of leading creatively in a faith space.
It's funny that you asked that, because I can think of a lot of challenges as well, right? Leading in the faith space or not in the faith space, right? Creatives, for anyone in production, and you do a lot of productions yourself, that, creatives, it's like herding cats, right? It's, we creatives think outside the box, which means that, organization and all these sort of things, the structure is not always the easiest, right?
Yes. And you become a creative often because you have a clear vision about what creativity should be, and so everyone's got an opinion, and there's a subjectivity to all of it, and
that's right, exactly. You can tell a story a million and one ways, and then everyone has their vision of how to do it, right? So it is challenging, but one of the blessings of working in faith is that it is that we're talking about stories of hope, and this is something that Al Gordon of Saint Church also talks about, is that we sometimes forget in this age that God and Jesus is the source of all creativity.
Yes.
We knew that when we saw the incredible works like, through Mozart or Sistine Chapel, right? Those generations really understood that, and I think we've sort of forgotten.
Yes.
But I think the great thing about working in faith films or faith programs is that we're going to God for creativity. We ask Him, how do we make this different? How do we make this special? How do we storytell powerfully? And then He guides us and leads us. And I think that's incredible. And we work with in all our faith programs, we work with those who believe and those who don't believe, and that's biblical, we believe. And I think that it's and God will guide both. And it's been such an incredible journey that way to journey to say, hey, you know what, our production house is Christian. We have a belief, but we will work in programs that are Christian, non-Christian. We just chase after God's heart in the whole media realm. And that's been so rewarding. And then to see lives changed is something that's really special as well. As a journalist for, 25 plus years, oftentimes I felt like we were shouting into the wind. We knew where Afghanistan was going. We saw the corruption in a certain country, and we showed it, and nothing happened. And sometimes things happen, but often nothing happened. The great thing about working on Alpha, on the Alpha series, is that you see lives transformed. You hear lives transformed, and the great thing about that also is that it's eternal transformation.
Yes.
One thing that we've learned through history is that we humans are not that good at solving problems. It's like, it's cyclical, right? We might fix something and it's wonderful for a period, and then it descends again, and then we have to have that fight over and over again. World War I, World War II, all these things, right? But the great thing about this is that, when we capture and document the stories of people's lives changed by God, it's eternal.
Yes.
And that heals me along the way. It's healed our team along the way in so many instances.
And Steve, as you've stepped up from being almost like a frontline creative into leading teams of creatives, massive projects with some of the best creatives in the film industry, which you're gathering from all over the world for some of these projects. What have you learned about how to set culture as a leader? And how have you managed to do that on set and in other contexts?
It's hard, and there's been a lot of learnings along the way. I'll bring it back to the Alpha Youth series. We really said, okay, how do we storytell new? And so we decided we're going to film the Alpha Youth series on a volume, this huge LED paneled sort of, elliptical screen on a soundstage thing. Basically we can create worlds on these LED panels, and that's our approach. But to do so, we needed Hollywood level, teams to work with. And so we chose to film in Melbourne, and the team that we brought on, had worked on all these incredible, films, Mad Max Fury and all these, and the majority had never heard of Jesus or didn't believe in it. And so I did what I had learned in the last few years, which is, to really reflect Jesus in it. And I remember, the first talk we had with 85 plus people on set. And I said, everyone, you may be used to working a certain way, but we want to set culture here. And we are going to be a hot set. And I borrowed this from Transformation Church in the US. Hot meaning humble, open, and transparent. And as I shared that and looked around the room, I could see eyes change. And then afterwards, like a sound person or a grip would come up and say, no one has ever set culture like that right from the start.
Really?
And we maintained that. You said, we're going to be humble enough to be wrong, open enough to have, to change our ideas, and transparent about our decisions about why we're doing this or that. And I think setting that, we've done it again and again and again, and we've seen that that's so important. And it's not easy. Setting culture, anyone who's a leader will know setting culture in a church, setting culture in a company, in an organization, it's so hard.
Yes.
And it takes everyone pulling in the same direction. And at times, you're going to fail. Oftentimes, you're going to fail. But I think that, if you can set that, I was just recently on a shoot for Warner Brothers, and we and it was a very tough shoot, 6 weeks, no days off, 16, 18-hour days.
Goodness me.
And I did the same thing. I was directing this one. And, at the end, people said that, yes, it was tough. Yes, there were a lot of problems. But again, setting it right at the start helped us, and it made us willing to dig deep for excellence, because we didn't have people that were too proud in terms of leaders to always need to be right. And maybe that's perhaps the biggest lesson, that, we as leaders can never assume or think that we're right, and that we all need correction.
So helpful, Steve. It's absolutely fascinating. And if there are people listening to this leading in different contexts, and a number of people who be listening who lead creative teams or work closely with creative teams, what would from your journey of leadership over the last few years in that context, what would your top tips be for leading well in a creative context?
The top tips probably would be, finding people that understand your vision.
Yeah.
And then pulling for that vision. So as we talked about earlier, it's setting the culture. Then it's about finding people that share that vision and pull towards that vision. And then once you establish that core leadership, ensure that vision and that culture filter down.
Yeah.
And you have to have constant check-ins.
Yeah.
And then you empower.
Yeah.
So once you set that culture, once you have that shared vision, and then you empower. And as you empower, then you need at times, each level needs to at times check in, make sure things are working, be directive when things are not working, readjust, and let them go. But empowering is so important, especially for this young generation. Gen Z is so talented. Yeah. And they need to be empowered, and they need to feel part of the team and have a voice. So empowering is so key. But you still do need to be directive when you need to be. Yeah. And then you pull back. And that's something I learned from, Idris Jala, one of the great minds of our time here in Kuala Lumpur, right? Yes. And he says that's how he set his culture, at his company that's so successful. And I've seen it really work, the sense of empowering, be directive, and pull back when you can.
And in terms of people you're recruiting, so there'll be lots of leaders who are hiring people or looking to build their teams. What are you looking for in terms of character of people that you want to bring onto your team?
Integrity. I think that's so important. You can have all the talent in the world, but if you don't have integrity, if you don't have this second thing, which is this willingness to work in a team, then it's really not going to work. On the productions that we're doing, they're such big productions. And this has been a big learning for me, because for years I was often with just a camera person and maybe a producer or a sound person, small little teams. But when we're working on this size of production that the Alpha series, requires, or other big film projects, you're working with dozens of people at any given time. And if you're not team oriented, it's not going to work. And we've had a lot of failings on that point. We've hired some great, incredible, award-winning team members, but they're all about, their form of storytelling.
Yes.
And unless they're willing to work with others,
Yeah.
you're just doomed to fail.
So interesting. Someone once said to me, you've got to be willing to sacrifice your preferences for the project's priorities. I've always found that quite a helpful thing in my mind, because sometimes we can have our preferred ways of doing things and we think, well, I like it like this. But I guess part of pulling for the team is that you're willing to sacrifice your preferences for the overall vision.
That's a great way of saying it. And yeah, definitely. I talked about vision earlier, but that vision does adjust.
Yeah.
And I feel that you can't be so stubborn. You have to maintain a certain, vision that you believe God is, directing you towards. But in that, you have to ensure that, the other voices are heard, whether that be, alpha leader voices, or members of your team, this, the assistant producer, this, that is just joining. Allowing those preferences, your preferences, to be adjusted by, by input. Yeah.
And Steve, we talked before about how sometimes when you're involved in a project with kingdom impact, there can be contestation. And how have you coped when things haven't gone well, or you feel that a project's really struggled, or just there's been things which there's been unusual contestation? So how do you cope when things feel like they're going a bit wrong?
I don't know if I always cope so well, to be honest. I think I'm a bit of a worrier at times, so it does keep me up at nights when things are not going well. But the opposition is so real.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I know I know you've experienced it, right? And it just comes out of nowhere. And you're like, I've worked so hard to set the culture. I've been trying to be open and transparent.
Yeah.
Why is this like falling apart? What's happening?
Yeah.
And sometimes you realize it's spiritual. So what do you do? Prayer 100%.
Yeah.
But what else do you do? And I've learned I haven't always been good at conflict. In a sense of I can report on conflict.
Yes.
Easy, no problems.
Yeah.
But how do I deal with conflict in my personal life?
Yeah.
I tend to avoid, I think, right? So, but that's part of leadership that you can't. And I've learned to really lean in, no matter how hard it is.
Yes.
No matter how many accusations come at you, rightly or wrongly, and just take it. And what I've learned through that is that the more you bring things into the light, the better it is.
Yes.
And I think that's godly.
Yes.
So you don't let things simmer. You pull it in and then you discuss.
Yeah.
If there's a conflict between two team members, really, or different departments, you bring it together and say, okay, what is going on? Let's talk it through.
Yeah.
Bring it into the light. And I think that's so important. Even things that you don't want to, on set that might happen, you really need to bring it into the light.
That's such a helpful image. I love that image, Steve, bringing even challenging situations and conflicts in the team into the light. I love that image. Someone once said to me that every time you avoid a difficult conversation, you incur a debt that eventually has to be paid anyway. So it's almost like there's a debt. It's not like it goes away. You're growing a relational debt, and eventually you're going to have that conversation. But it's a really helpful image, the idea of bringing challenging situations into the light. Steve, the other thing I really admire, if you don't mind me saying, is that you strike me as a fascinating mix of kind of bold humility. So you have a really clear creative vision, and you're operating at a very high level. But whenever I've worked with you in different contexts, there's kind of a gentle humility about you, and it's quite rare that those things come together. Where do you think that's come from, and how do you sustain that even when the pressure's on?
Thanks for saying that, Stephen. Wow. Okay. Fantastic. Excellent. Where does that come from? Is that true? I think the boldness comes. I self-doubt quite a bit. I really do self-doubt quite a bit. But I think the boldness comes especially strong when I know that I'm doing what God wants. And how do we know what God wants? It's really when I don't spend enough time in the Word, when I don't spend enough time with, my Bible study team or with others, or worship, or time in church, listening to you speak in Oxford, wherever. Really, like, then I think that confidence goes. And but I feel that confidence is in knowing that that God has backed you.
Yeah.
And as a youth, I was cocky. I think, I thought I knew it all at 15 or 16. And then, then I think, through Jesus's example of humbleness, but also of age, of realizing that, now in my 50s, you don't know very much.
I don't believe it, Steve.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much, Stephen. But yeah, in my 50s, you realize you actually don't know as much as you ever think you do. And there's always so much to learn.
Yeah.
And I think, the God of all ages, just Jesus himself humbled himself. God humbled himself and came to earth, and we always need to humble ourselves, and that's perhaps my best answer to that.
It's a great answer. And just say, Steve, the other thing I've noticed about you is no matter how high the pressure is, and you, as we've been hearing, extraordinarily pressured environments you've worked in throughout your career, you're the calmest person in the room. And I remember we were working on a project once, and there was something else happening in another continent you were involved in, and something else happening over here, and the pressure was on, and you were just so calm. And what is it that creates that calm in you? And because that must be such an inspiration to the teams you lead, that you always seem to be calm.
That's another good question. You're a great interviewer, Stephen Foster. That might have come just from the years of learning, being in, war zones, having rockets coming at you, being in the middle of firefights, not sure of, if or when you're going to get out. Yeah. Not sure if that road is going to be fully landmined, but managing to navigate it out.
Yes.
I think that's a trained skill. They always say that, your neural pathways have to be trained. And perhaps it's, a large part of that is training, but then I would still bring it back to the spiritual.
Yes.
That, if you know where you're going, and I know I'm going towards Jesus, then everything else is manageable. And I think it is a deep knowing. And so then that puts the priorities in place.
Yeah.
Then that, yes, this production may be going downhill at the moment, but God is in control. And then you have to trust that either there's a reason for the down and we need to bring something to the light, or this was not meant to be the way that it is, but trust that there is a reason, and then go to God, seek answers, find those in your group, hear from your leaders, and it can be solved.
It's amazing, Steve. And just last thing I'd like to ask is, there'll be people listening to this who are in their early 20s, who are up and coming creatives. And what would you say to yourself as a kind of a young creative? What would be your best pieces of advice for people who are listening, who are either just starting in the film industry, or just starting in the creative industry, or just starting their leadership journey? What would your advice be to them?
What I would say is, you need to be hungry. Right now, we have social media, and there's a din of all of this creativity happening. People are creating all over the place. And if you want to succeed in the creative industry, you really need to stick out. And the ones that I've seen that have stuck out are those that desperately really are hungry to get there.
Yeah.
So that means what I say to the young people that we bring on is, if you want to be a young producer, a young creative, a young editor, you should be the first in the office and the last to leave. And it's not about showing face and saying, oh, I work so hard. It's just a posture of, I am hungry to learn. And then I would say that, you have to have a posture of, I'm not above that.
Yeah.
When I was young, I was expected to, tear scripts, bring coffee to the anchor, do all these things, right?
Yeah.
But that's important even as a team.
Yeah.
That you're like, those who say, oh, you know what, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing, sometimes loses the sense of, why is it important if we all pitch in to do things? Because you're building team and you're supporting each other.
Yeah.
So be hungry, be willing to take on things that you might think that are not what you want to do necessarily. And then I think the other one is be consistent.
Yeah.
And that's one of the hardest things. And, perhaps a lot of the leadership books talk about this too. What is an awesome, amazing trait for highly successful people is consistency. That supersedes talent time and time again. You might be an incredible storyteller, incredible editor, incredible motion graphics or animator, but consistency trumps talent.
Steve, thank you so much for your time today. It's just absolutely fascinating conversation. I feel like I could talk to you for hours.
Likewise.
You must come back on again and we can talk some more. But thank you so much for your time today and wonderful to have the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today on The Thread, and we look forward to being with you next time. The Thread podcast is brought to you by Alpha, the home of curiosity, conversations, and exploring the Christian faith together. If you know someone who's curious about faith, Alpha might just be the space for them. Why not visit alpha.org or follow us on Instagram and share an invite to a course near you.